Hey, welcome to the For Evansville podcast. My name is Adrian. I'm here with our executive director, Jonathan.
Hey.
And before we get started with today's podcast, we have a special announcement that our next episode is going to be with the mayor of Evansville himself on the For Evansville podcast. Seems like a dream.
It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, it has been. So make sure you like, subscribe, follow us on Instagram or Spotify so you can make sure you don't miss that episode. So today's interview, though, is with Zac Parsons of Honeymoon. That's probably where you've heard the name or seen his face. But Jonathan, why did we have him on with us today?
Yeah, we're really excited about the conversation we got to have with Zac because, our new vision is advancing human flourishing through the church.
Yep.
And we see that as something that happens in a way that's integrated with our city. We want to help see Christians and churches work together with people in our city and alongside people with our city to pursue common good.
Yeah.
While also maintaining a distinct identity and worldview and all of those things. And that's easier said than done. This idea of inclusive collaboration, of people bringing their whole self to the table, requires a lot of humility and a lot of listening. And we thought that this episode would be a good opportunity for us to hear from somebody who's not part of the Christian community or who approaches that question from outside of a Christian perspective to say, what does it look like for Christians to meaningfully work alongside people in our city who aren't Christians and maybe come from a different faith perspective, or maybe would say that they don't have a religious affiliation or things like that. And so Zac brings a really unique perspective to this conversation because he sort of grew up as a Christian and as part of the Christian community. He was in ministry and now would not identify as Christian or see himself as part of the Christian community. So he's kind of seen both sides and is able to weigh in some interesting ways on this question. And so for you, our listeners, and for us, this is really an opportunity to practice that value of humble curiosity and listen and learn and wrestle with this question of what's it look like for the church to advance human flourishing in our city.
Yeah, and you may notice that today's episode is a bit longer than usual. That's because kind of the first bit of it, that Zac shares his kind of full faith journey story with us, which we were very humbled and glad to hear from him. It's always great to hear people's stories first, and then we kind of dive into what Jonathan was just talking about and getting down to the nitty gritty. So you don't want to miss or stop the episode too soon.
Yeah, it was a great conversation, and we are glad to be able to share it with you today. Hey, Zac.
What would you describe yourself as? Like the founder?
Co-founder. Yeah, my wife could be listening to this. Be careful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. No, you were just saying it was really her.
Yeah. Co-founder is usually, what we say.
Okay.
But I think my wife is now technically the CEO.
Okay.
So and everyone who works for us sort of knows that she's really in charge. But
okay.
Co-founder.
So what does that make you in addition to co-founder? Like if she's the CEO,
so
you're the guy who renovates all of the new spaces, or?
Yes, there's something about I actually do kind of embrace the role of maintenance man.
Okay. Yeah.
So like Karate Kid, the original Karate Kid from '84 is like a very impactful movie for me.
So whenever new baristas come in, you're like
I tell them to paint the fence,
but also teaching them, these life lessons in how to make coffee.
Yeah. Not to be too self-aggrandizing, but that is sort of how. Because honestly, you're in a business that a lot of things break down, and it's not just sit around and have meaningful conversations with people all day long over lattes. It's like, well, the ice machine actually needs to be fixed, and the toilet's clogged, and whatever else. So. Yeah,
those
maintenance
espresso
man.
Machine maintenance is no joke.
Oh yeah, I mean, made in Italy, and good luck, finding instructions quickly on how to repair those. So co-founder or maintenance man.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for taking a break from those responsibilities.
Right. Thank you for giving me a break
today.
Just be able to sit and talk.
It's
kind
your
of coffee shop.
Yeah.
This is your coffee shop today.
And I should have brought coffee. Shoot.
We were kind of hoping, but that's okay.
It's that weird time of day. We're recording this in the afternoon. Can I get away with that? That I was sensitive to your caffeine levels?
That's fine.
Sure.
We'll accept that excuse. Thank you for being here and for joining us on this conversation.
Well, and can I just also say I appreciate the explicit step that For Evansville has made in this direction, because I think that there was sort of two directions or two missions that people in the community could have picked up on that were the mission. Sure. And sort of the flourishing of the city, in a way that does not acknowledge sort of the Christian sort of founding and undertones or overtones of what, is often what For Evansville is about. And so I think it's just very refreshing that the cards are on the table and that will generate different kinds of conversations and put things out there that might make people uncomfortable, but are true to the way that you just articulated those values. So kudos, and let's go. Let's see what sorts of, more deep and real, conversations come from it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And I think that was really our hope in that transition was not to try to do something separate from a lot of the collaboration and flourishing that's happening in the city, but to recognize that that's a unique role that we can play within our city and the things that are happening here, is to kind of bring that specific faith element into it. And so that's why we're excited to kind of dive into this conversation, is because that is an important part of the role that we want to play, but we want to play it really well. And I think there's a lot of nuance there. And so, I've kind of alluded to the fact that we were excited to have you in this conversation because of your perspective within both sides. Would you mind sharing just kind of a brief summary of what that faith journey has been like for you, or what your perspective is now, just for our listeners to kind of understand where you're coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for giving me the chance to kind of tell this, because I think it's easy to hear someone self-identify under a certain label and have a lot of assumptions around sort of what that means. And I think everybody does have a journey, and that their faith might look differently at different times in their life. And so for me, when I was going through that age of early to middle adolescence and stopped being a kid as much and started making decisions for myself and deciding what I valued and also what I was interested in, interestingly, some kids collect baseball cards or, do model airplanes or video games, and I did some of that, but I was actually really into religion, and my Christian faith actually was, I don't want to call it a hobby, but it was like a passion.
Yeah.
And it actually started with me, I grew up in the Phoenix area, specifically Mesa, Arizona, which was actually founded by Mormons about a century ago. And there's still a huge Mormon population in there. In fact, my middle school, 65% of my classmates were Mormon. Wow. Latter-day Saint. And so I was curious about them. I don't know if I'd call it humble curiosity, but we share a same sacred text in the Bible from the Christian faith that I was raised in. And so I began to explore what the differences were between our theologies and found it interesting. And then we would get into conversations and debates and arguments. And at one point I was flipping through my Bible looking for sort of fresh ammunition for the fight, and came across a verse from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 7:3. How can you judge the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye when you have a plank in your own? Yeah. And as I look back at some of my behaviors as a middle school boy, and even just the attitude with which I was approaching those conversations, it wasn't humble, it wasn't loving. Had a moment to where I realized that how I was living wasn't aligned with what God would have wanted for me. And everything changed on that moment. And became very serious about my faith. And that's like sort of what people knew me for in my community was Zac is all about Jesus.
Yeah.
One of my early email addresses was zride17@idigjesus.net.
Oh, nice. Okay. All those cringy.
I loved it. I mean, I would wear, the Christian shirts, what would Jesus do bracelets, like for spring break, other kids are going to get, drunk in Tijuana, and I was going to Tijuana to build houses, for people.
Yeah.
And every summer it was church. So I was like all in on Christianity.
Sure.
To the point where I knew I wanted to do that as a profession. So you go to Bible college to be able to be trained for that. And in my first year of Bible college, I met a girl who recommended that I get an internship in her hometown of Evansville, Indiana. Never heard of it before.
Yeah.
So that led me to apply for the internship and got that. And I was at Crossroads Christian Church in Newburgh, formerly Cullen Avenue Christian Church, just before then. And that introduced me to Evansville. And met a girl, got married, finished Bible college, started a career in full-time ministry outside of Detroit. Okay. And had a couple of unfortunate experiences in the church to where there was a church split. And those can be painful in a lot of different ways.
Not unfamiliar with that.
Yeah. And it's, unfortunate, but it's the reality.
Yeah.
And churches do have to sort of run on budgets. And in both of those cases, the budget for my role was eliminated. And so I had sort of this two strikes sort of situation early on in my career and thought, I'm not going to wait for strike number 3. I think I'm going to get out of ministry and find something else.
Okay.
So once I left ministry as a vocation, that kind of freed me up a little bit to explore some things in my faith that had started to trouble me, that I couldn't make sense of, that were very black and white to me when I was a teenager. And as I went to Bible college, got a degree in the Bible, learned Greek, a little bit of Greek, I should say, but was doing some of my own Bible translation and just learned how the Bible was put together and the different denominational structures and how we have these different denominations. It just really changed my theology from black and white to more shades of gray. And so I was open to different interpretations of how people could understand the truth. And then eventually it actually sort of broke loose into maybe I don't think there are any rules you can believe in. There's no black and white. It's not even gray. Everything is up for interpretation, kind of a postmodern perspective on it. Okay. And but didn't want to give up my faith, my Christianity as a label. And so I would identify as a universalist at that point, a universalist Christian. So there was a type of liberalization of my faith over a few years. Then I had I'll be honest, I could say that I had a divorce, but I had an affair, which led to a divorce. And in that experience, had to really recognize who is it that I was trying to please in my life. Was it God or was it me? And it was very clear that it was me. And the things that I would attribute to prayers were actually more just me trying to find justification for the things in my life that I wanted. Interestingly, that divorce led to my ex-wife relocating back to Evansville. So now my children and my ex-wife are in Evansville. So if I want to be around them, I need to come back and do that. So moved back to Evansville, and we actually reconciled. There was a service at Crossroads Christian Church where Kyle Eidelman actually was guest speaking. And it might have even been Father's Day. I don't remember what it was, but it hit me in all the places of, you need to return home. And for me, that was returning to my faith, returning to my family. And then a funny thing happened as we put the pieces back together. I really couldn't make sense of how I had wandered so far away while still praying. And I landed in a type of theology that put a lot of emphasis on your experience of God, and that if you wanted to know God's will for your life, ask him. Ask him about everything, and be open to listen. Yeah. And I couldn't make sense of the responses that I interpreted. And I remember thinking, maybe there isn't a God. Wonder what that would feel like. And I remember almost like trying on a mantle of atheism, a mindset of, what if there is no God? And it sort of snapped into place in a way that I didn't expect. And it stayed in place in a way that I definitely wouldn't have expected. And some problems that I had had theologically went away, and some new problems developed, but it stuck, and it became the way that I identified for about the next several years. Interestingly, because that also has sort of a black and white assessment of reality, that also started to lose its hold on me. And I softened in my atheism into an agnosticism. So atheists are going to say there is no God, as a matter of fact.
Right.
An agnostic would say we can't know if there's a God or not, but I'm going to lean towards not and just call myself an agnostic. Eventually, even that felt a little too negative, and I've landed on a sort of a current identification as a humanist. And as I see people of many different faith perspectives, or no faith perspective, that are doing things out of love, I see that love in them and that human spirit, and I celebrate that. So that would include people from my Christian roots and people in my community who do identify as Christians that I see acting in love as part of a tribe that I would identify with. I know you asked me to give a short version, and I kind of got wound up there a little bit, but you got to hit all the beats.
On, like, all the hats, so it's hard to get through that quick.
Right, yeah. And we also, we're talking about bringing your whole self to the table. So thank you for doing that and sharing all of that so openly. Really appreciate that. And I had never heard, I don't think, that full scope of your story. So I appreciate the opportunity to know that about you. And I think that gives us a good context for, you've kind of seen this from a lot of different angles and kind of been part of faith communities in a lot of different ways. And so that's why we're excited to kind of have this conversation with you and explore some of these ideas with you. And we kind of put together 3 sort of overarching questions, but we can just kind of have a conversation around these questions, I think. But the 3 questions that we want to try to touch on are, what does it look like for Christians to bring their faith to the table in a way that's really valuable and constructive? What does it look like for that to happen in ways that maybe aren't so valuable or constructive, or ways that sometimes that can go wrong? And then how do we create environments where people of different faith perspectives or worldviews can work together toward the common good without diluting their individual faith perspectives or feeling like they need to leave them at home? And so those are kind of 3 big buckets, and we can sort of explore them one at a time. But I want to kind of start with this idea of, like, you even mentioned just now from your current perspective, seeing a lot of value in people of faith motivated by love, engaging in the community. I'd be curious to hear, what are some examples that you see of that, and like what are ways that you've seen Christians specifically in churches engage in the community in ways that their faith was a value to the community, even maybe to people who don't share their faith perspective?
There's a lot of questions.
And that's not all just on you to answer that question either. We want to kind of have a conversation about it too. So,
well, the first thing that kind of came to mind as you were describing that was some of the exposure that I've had with Habitat for Humanity. And, my understanding is former President Jimmy Carter has had a large role in that, and believe he identifies as a Christian. And the way that organization's mission plays out is that they want to engage people that are motivated by their faith to help with volunteering and building and fundraising, but there's not an expectation on the other side of that says, well, if you want to have this house, you're going to have to, make sure that you affirm all the same sort of theological concepts that we do. You got to be one of us if you want to be served by us.
Right.
And so whatever that sort of is that hits on that common good point that you had mentioned before, I feel like they are a good example of that. And don't shy away from including, when they do home dedications, like they offer a prayer. I believe they offer a Bible. And that might be specific to each homeowner. It might just be sort of a recognition that this is an organization that has a theological motivation around it, and they're doing their best to still deliver that with love.
Yeah, that's really good. You go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just curious how, there's part of you that's involved in the community, I know, but I don't actually know to the extent of that, but also how Honeymoon kind of fits into that story.
So the interesting thing for me about the role that religion and faith and church and community had in my life, we call them the formative years for a reason. Like they really were formative in ways that you can't quite cut your roots out of you without, the fruits being affected. And I believe that the things in my life that are fruits that people would look and say, Zac brings this sort of energy to our projects came from those experiences in the church. But if you don't have a God that you can clearly identify and articulate, it makes it challenging to have a church. So I think for me, a lot of that energy sort of goes towards the deepness that comes from sometimes the relationships that you have within your church community. It goes into that for me.
Okay.
And the age that I was when I was a pastor, it fit for me to be sort of a youth minister. And the age of the employees that we have at Honeymoon sort of fits that sort of youth minister / college ministry work as well. Yeah. Now I'm in my early, almost mid 40s. I'm 43. It's I feel sort of at home approaching certain elements of what we do from a pastoral sort of energy.
Okay.
That's interesting. That makes me think there's kind of another layer there. I think things like Habitat or these very overt expressions of love and service in the community are some of the obvious things that come to mind, but that aspect of deep, rich community that I think is not always present in Christian community, but I think is certainly part of kind of the legacy of Christianity and this idea of loving one another as Christ has loved you, this deep commitment to one another, that brings something to the fabric of a society that can sometimes be very individualistic and very isolated and divided along a lot of different lines. And again, I'm talking idealistically, I think, about the Christian faith and what it looks like for Christian community when it's at its best. But that brings kind of a layer that you're talking about of formation of people and formation that's inclined outward, in a way that's maybe different than the default story of our society, which is me focused potentially.
Yeah, and that's actually a tension that I always sort of come back to, is a recognition that my experiences greatly inform how I understand what's true. And we're kind of getting back to this whole postmodern thing, is you're going to have different experiences that inform your values. I mean, we can talk about traumas and wounds, and that there might be a way that someone's father wounded them in serious ways to where the idea of God as a father is repulsive.
Right.
There are other people who have those similar experiences where the idea of God as a father is absolutely what they need because they need a replacement for their incredibly fallen father. Mm-hmm. And so when I think about both of those two realities from maybe similar situations, I almost always lean towards the idiosyncratic and individual interpretation of life and of truth and of meaning, and that it's context dependent and sometimes it's time dependent. And how you feel about something might change based on what you haven't gone through yet. The stages of life, how we change when we become parents, when we become grandparents, when we lose, people at a certain time, that changes how we reinterpret something from our past in possibly a significant way. And how do you make sense of that with the capital T truth?
Right. Yeah.
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 I'm wondering I feel like a lot of our listeners are church leaders or people in the faith community. And so how do you feel like I feel like now, especially with the buzzword of deconstruction or your own journey of going through these things, how can someone of the Christian faith kind of walk alongside you just as a friend or people going on these journeys without, I don't want to say like Jesus juking them or being like, yeah, you're going through this hard time, but this is what the Bible says. When you're even struggling, like, do I believe the Bible or do I believe, how can someone kind of walk alongside you?
It's, again, it is tough, and maybe it speaks to the bias that I have and sort of where I've landed on this in that more sort of individual, interpretation of what's true and outside of a formal faith community that's clear on, hey, this is what we believe. But with that being said, I think that somebody in a situation like that should really focus on what love looks like from multiple angles, and that if they're doubting their intentions, if they're doubting the motivations for their participation in talking with somebody about their deconstruction, to seek out the wise counsel and seek out multiple perspectives to say, hey, does this feel like objectively like I'm loving this person? Does this feel manipulative? That's really like how it's a somewhat scientific way to view it, I guess. But that's what, if I am going to lean towards an individual understanding of truth, then you got to get a bunch of individuals' perspectives in order to get something closer to objectivity.
Well, I think that what you're saying totally translates into community work. If you're trying to help someone or walk alongside someone, regardless of knowing what their faith journey is, but just their life journey, getting multiple perspectives, that would make total sense.
And even as you said that, it made me think of the example of a doctor. How many stories do we know of people who've received a specific diagnosis and questioned it or rejected it, and then found another or another and another until they have something closer to a consensus.
Yeah. This brings up another question that I was kind of thinking about in preparation for this conversation, and I'm not quite sure how to formulate the question, but I think it's something around this idea of, it feels like there's a little bit of a tension, and maybe what I'm wondering is if this is a false tension between the ability between loving somebody and agreeing with them. So this question of like, how do you walk alongside somebody who's going through a journey like this? But even broader than that, how do you walk alongside somebody and love somebody when there's severe disagreement about what would we define as true? Because I think that is such a core important aspect of the Christian faith to a lot of Christians, this idea of absolute truth, this idea that Jesus as a person is like the representation of truth. But oftentimes I feel like that becomes a barrier to genuinely loving people when I don't know that it has to be. So I'd be curious to hear your perspective on that. And I think you were kind of getting at how sometimes that barrier comes in because our motivation is not actually genuinely out of love. It's out of, well, I'm kind of just leaning in because I want to convince you over to my way of thinking. Sure. And so I guess what I'm wondering is like, what does it look like to truly love someone and hold tightly to your perspective of truth, whether you're a Christian or you have another perspective of truth? But what does it look like to truly love somebody without feeling like you need to compromise your perspective of truth, but also feeling like maybe we don't need to agree on what that is for me to be here with you in the midst of what you're struggling with, or to love you and care for you. So I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Man, you just brought up like a whole bunch of interesting things. I hope I can juggle all of them getting out there. But the first one that comes to mind is the example of how Jesus encourages us to love our enemies, and how radical that still seems, and how we are taught, and it makes sense to me that was just a completely bonkers thing at the time that he was sort of promoting, and that is sort of what separated it from the other, religious and civic, ways of life previous, and did end up sort of transforming Rome and eventually the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And that if you are loving someone you identify as an enemy, that really does take away it takes a lot of things off the table to where you don't need to agree. That's it's
you wouldn't
not
be an enemy if you
agreed. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it doesn't say love your enemy until they're not your enemy anymore. Like that's part of what makes it radical.
Yeah.
It's like, love this person who maybe you don't even see as an enemy, but they might see you as an enemy. And the disagreement will probably continue.
Yeah.
The other thing for me goes back to time, and just how we can be double-minded ourselves around a similar topic just from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, and especially over the passage of time, that we might not even agree with ourselves, moment to moment, year to year, and that doesn't mean that we are actually different people. But the unification in our complete experience is not unlike the unity that we can feel with somebody, even acknowledging differences within how we might understand something to be true. And I think making it explicit is helpful to like actually say to somebody, you know what, we don't have to agree on everything. But what I do know is that I'm hungry, you're hungry, and I enjoy your company. And so can we sit down for a meal together and talk about the things that are alive for both of us? That feels like love to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it. Okay, so I want to take it the other direction then and say, what are some ways that this can go wrong sometimes? And I think this is one of those questions that's like, okay, there's a lot of things we could talk about here that might be a little uncomfortable to bring up, or things like that. But I think it's important to just kind of acknowledge that there is a way to bring your faith to the table in a way that does not result in love of somebody else, and that they don't leave that table feeling like you had their best interest at heart. And so I'd be curious to hear your perspective, or even examples without, specifically calling anybody out. But what does it look like, or maybe what are some of the ways to approach that we might want to avoid, because even if they're good intentioned, they don't result in the kind of love or common good within the community that we might be striving for.
So what's coming up for me when you ask this question is that idea of the tension between majority and minority in all sorts of different contexts. And even the story that I brought up about my experience in middle school was the experience of being in a religious minority, and how I interpreted it. Someone else could look at that and say, hey, you guys are both talking about Jesus. What do you mean? Like, a Muslim might be like, what minority are you talking about?
Right.
But depending on what the context of the situation is, Christians might be majorities in some of those contexts. Mm-hmm. And I think whenever you find the identity that you are currently identifying with, sorry, I don't have a better word to blend with that, but if there's a role that you are taking on, and that role has you in a majority position, and you are not sensitive and caring towards those who would identify in a minority position, that doesn't feel like love. If you are in a majority and you force your position on a minority, that doesn't feel like love. The example, the specific example that I won't name names on would be especially in a community like Evansville, if you're in a public setting and it's time to open up business and it's opened with a prayer, it's probably going to be a Christian prayer. There's an implicit and sometimes explicit call to join that prayer, or at least bow your head in some cases. And I wonder how it would be experienced. We'll just use Muslims for an example, because there are Muslim-dominated countries. Mm-hmm. If we found ourselves in a Muslim-dominated country and we were about to start a soccer game or something like that, and said, all right, everybody, we're going to bow to Mecca and we are going to pray, would Christians feel comfortable with that?
Right.
Or would the more loving thing to do for those in that majority position be to have like a sensitivity around how the minority might experience that?
Sure.
And we could open up a whole bunch of cans of worms of minority and majority here, but maybe that's the way that I'm interpreting how love in the context of how faith comes to play and bringing your full self to it that can sometimes go too far.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it brings to mind something that I think about a lot, which is what's the appropriate way for a follower of Jesus to exercise power? Being in the majority is a form of power. It's a form of social power, among other things, and
political,
all sorts of aspects there, and one of the, I think, fundamental teachings of Jesus is, the Bible says he didn't consider equality with God something to be clung to and used for his own advantage, but humbled himself and took on the form of a servant. So you have this picture of Jesus as kind of the most powerful being to ever live. And how did he exercise that power? It was to love and serve, to take on the form of a servant. And so this tricky question of majority and minority, and where do you find yourself and how do you exercise that power, I feel like gets into that question of, am I using that power to love and serve other people? And I think there's a lot of tricky nuances there, because I think a lot of Christians would say, well, if I believe that Jesus really is the truth, then the loving thing to do is to share that with other people. But then the question is around, like, is forcing them to participate in something they're not comfortable with the best way to share that or to extend that invitation? So, that's an interesting dynamic and tension for sure. But what would you say is because I think there's an aspect of that too that and this sort of gets into our last question, but there's an aspect of that scenario of okay, we're gathered together for some communal purpose and we're going to open with a prayer. Something like that is a way that somebody might be thinking, well, that's me bringing my whole self to the table, And so what's maybe the difference, I guess, between that, where you're inviting or expecting everybody to participate in that way, versus like, I'm going to bring my whole self to the table and not leave my faith perspective behind, but I'm also going to bring it with me in a way that's not imposing on other people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, because I think to me, it seems like there are two ways that we try to approach kind of spaces where there are different faith perspectives or worldviews represented. One is we're just not going to talk about it, and everybody just leave your faith perspective behind, and we'll just kind of get along together.
We know in our hearts that we represent Jesus.
Yeah, it's kind of like, and if everybody, and so that's kind of like, okay, we're going to leave it behind. And then I think the other way is to try to find some kind of common denominator between different perspectives that actually doesn't really fully reflect or respect or uphold anybody's faith perspective, And so what I'm kind of brainstorming at here is like, what does it look like to create spaces where everybody can bring their whole self to the table, their faith perspective can inform their participation in working together without like imposing on other people or creating an environment where it's not helpful or constructive.
So what I'd say to that has to do with power again. And I like how you brought it back to strength and power and how that power is used or not used. And one of the cool things about religion and what I think does draw people and gives them power is the belief that God is for them, that God chased them, that God loves them so much that he died for them, and that God's power is greater than humans' power. And so, you know how sometimes if somebody is trying to sell you something and they're trying really hard, it actually sort of undermines your appreciation of the value that you might have, come to just sort of on your own assessment. It's like, why are they trying so hard? What's going on here? Like this, whatever it is that you're trying to sell me should speak for itself. So I kind of feel that way in faith situations sometimes. Of the quote that always comes to mind, and again, this is great. So when I identify as a humanist, like I get to bring Jesus in there, and I love Jesus, and he's an amazing human. C.S. Lewis would fight me on this, of course, but the quote that I love is from Francis of Assisi, and it's preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. And that element of when it's so clear that what you're doing is out of love, that it doesn't need to be made explicit as something like, and therefore you must recognize me as a Christian and understand that this is my motivation, and I hope that I play a role in your conversion, whatever that, like, you have to step away from all of that. If you truly trust the power of God who is chasing everybody, you have to trust that he's going to do that. That's a way that I sort of interpret maybe an approach that might be a mature way to bring your faith that doesn't always have to make it explicit. So I know I just said the same thing backwards. Make it explicit, except when you don't make it explicit.
Yeah.
But there is an appropriate way if it needs to be known that this is what you're bringing to the table, that you can do that.
Sure. Do either of you have like examples that come to mind of like where you've seen people do this really well? Like they're not shy about their own faith perspective and the motivation that brings to them to engage in a space, but it's in a way that's well received by the people around them. Or is that just super rare, borderline impossible?
No, I think in organizations, like you said, Habitat, that was your first example, where they're not shy about it. They may give a Bible or they may pray, but there's no, like dotted line when they get a house or something. I think in my own life, like people that have shown that are the ones who do show that unconditional love. Like, like I use my mom as an example a lot, where like my friends are getting like DUIs and they're calling my mom to like confess to her. And she's like, okay, just don't do it again. That's not okay, right? And they're like, yes, I'm sorry, and they're like, they don't love Jesus or anything, like they don't, but they just like want to hear from my mom, and she doesn't bring it into the conversation either. But it's like that unconditional love that she's just constantly going to be serving people, that they want to be around her. Mm-hmm. But they also know, they're like, I know that you come from a faith family, and if I wanted to go to church with you, your mom would probably cry and hug me forever or whatever. But like at the same time, it doesn't matter. Like if I do that or not, she's going to love me no matter what. And I think there's those people that we kind of run into in life that we're like, yeah, I can see Jesus in them for sure. And I know that's what they're motivated by, but they're not talking to me about it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is like the area of this whole conversation that I feel the most tension around, because I do think that the idea of sharing the good news of Jesus is like a core piece of the Christian faith, at least for a good chunk of, Christians. I think some traditions emphasize it more than others or go about it in different ways. But I think that it's become something for a lot of people that is very like transactional and salesy. It's like, I'm trying to sell you a belief system instead of it really feeling like I'm sharing good news with somebody. And to me, I think those two aspects of like, okay, I'm not trying to sell you something, and I don't have this ulterior motive of trying to get you on my side or something, but also doing it in a context of unconditional love. That is, I'm not loving you and walking alongside you so that I can sell you on something. It's not like multi-level marketing company Christianity where it's like, I'm kind of blending my
get you on my downline
personal relationship with this, business endeavor that I have. And so like, I guess what I'm wondering is like, is there a way for Christians to genuinely and authentically share what they see as good news with somebody in a way that also feels like an expression of love, and also honors that person's own journey? And like you said, kind of like, it's not my job to convince you that this is true, but to offer it to you almost as like, this is something that has been deeply impactful to me and came as good news to me, and I'm sharing it with you as an expression of love that whether you take it or leave it, I'm going to continue to love you. And you know what I mean? Like, or I guess I'm curious to hear from your perspective, Zac, is that just my Christian bias, kind of thinking that there's a way to do that actually somebody is always going to feel like, well, you're just trying to, kind of like win me over or something like that,
I'll tell you about some of my favorite relationships that I have with Christians, is that the ones where it's known at some point in our relationship, it's been made known that Jesus is at the center of their life. Mm-hmm. And then maybe immediately after that, it's like, but I know that you know that, and we don't have to talk about it anymore. But if you ever do want to, I'm here, but consider this the like acknowledgement that it existed.
Yeah. It's and then available, but not like
it's available, and you may not. I'm never going to bring it up again. But if you want to bring it up, let's dance, let's talk. And then as our relationship deepens and we experience life together, and then a question sort of comes up that it's time for them to respond. Like they can kind of give me a look and be like, well, you know what I'm going to say about this, right? Like, this is Jesus, like, obviously.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of funny, like, oh yeah, that's right. That's okay. That's the way you're going to answer that. Okay.
Right.
All right. Well, then we engage again, and it's sort of back on.
Right.
And I do think that it's something. I'm curious if I can turn the question back to you a little bit. Both of you, you guys are younger than me. Like we had the Gutenberg, printing press revolution. And a lot of that was like, there's an example of somebody who wanted to sort of spread the faith and it worked in that profound way through technology. I wonder if the sort of spreading the good news is going to be available to everyone through technology and our relationship to the internet and to knowledge and how this is going to change, the teaching profession. It's like, are we going to still need teachers to give us facts, or are the facts going to be everywhere and it's more about wisdom and how do we utilize things in certain ways to where Christianity or the good news is just known, at least the set of facts are known by everybody. Like, do you guys ever like think about how we're entering a unique time in history to where spreading the good news to the ends of the earth in some level may have already happened?
Yeah.
Like is that a profane thing to even throw out there?
Well, this is super interesting that you're asking this question. I think you touched on something that I would definitely think informs my answer to that question, which is the difference between knowing information and this idea of wisdom. And I think in the Christian tradition, the idea of the gospel is like somehow more than just information. It is a message that people share, but the Apostle Paul talks about it as something that he like received. It's something that's like given and passed on. And so I think there's a very personal component to it that's similar to the passage of wisdom as differentiated from a passage of knowledge, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And I think maybe that gets to the core of what we're talking about here, which is to just spout off information to people that they might not want to hear is not necessarily like even the faithful way to do that, but to do it in a relational way or in a personal way is somehow different. And I also think that there's an element of that is maybe more universal, that's not just applicable to Christians, but is part of this idea of bringing your whole self to the table. Because whenever you were kind of walking us through your journey, you were sharing, kind of here's my perspective and here's what I believe. And I think you would say that you've arrived at that as something that's valuable to you, and that if somebody came to you with questions and wanted to explore that or learn from your journey, that it's something that you would offer as an expression of love, to not say, I'm trying to convince you, I'm trying to sell you something, but you feel like you've arrived at some kind of understanding of the world that is beneficial to you. And I think Christians would say the same thing, but in a different way maybe. And so, yeah, it feels like there's an aspect of let's all bring our whole self to the table that's about working together toward the common good, about creating good in the world that we can all share in. But I think there's also this aspect of to love one another and to know one another is also to be able to have conversations about the truths that I hold most deeply and the truths that you hold most deeply, and to be able to talk about those in a loving and respectful way without us having to land in the same place at the end of the conversation.
You just said so many words you just used are like pinging on this metaphor that's really alive for me right now. And that's the idea of the map versus the territory. So we could have a map of anywhere, Evansville, United States, Mordor, and like
now you're talking.
There we go. The map, Rivendell. The map is a helpful representation of something that actually exists, but it isn't the thing that actually exists. And there became a point in my faith journey to where I started to recognize my faith and the tools of my faith, like the Bible, like the words Jesus, as more of a map and less of a territory. And that these are helpful for me, and the ways that I see echoes of Jesus in a movie like The Matrix or Braveheart or something like that. It's like those are other sort of maps that are pointing to a territory, a reality. And that as you love somebody, and you were using all this language of arrival and land, and I was like, that's it. When you want to love somebody, just acknowledge that this is the map that you have found useful. These are the places that you went to, and you can point back to them and say, I was there, and I called it this, and other people called it this. Maybe that's what it's called, but it seems like you are there now as well. Yeah. When you go through something like a divorce, a miscarriage, cancer, you seek out the people, or you draw them to you, and they explain, this is what I went through. It might be similar, but in the ways that it's different, you're going to have to walk through that yourself. But here's what my map showed me.
Yeah, that's really true in my own journey as well, of helping people walk through hard things. And I had, like you said, this map, like what the Bible says and what, people and like spiritual leaders in my life have said, and I hold on to those truths and try to walk other people through with those truths. But then they happened to me, and all of a sudden it's like I've been dropped in the territory. Like I've been dropped there instead of looking at a map, and the landscape is totally different. And so that's a really good analogy. It's like something to think about.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I would add to that is that you can operate in that way in community with each other, in relationship with each other, and still like really believe that your map is the right one. You know what I mean? Like I think something.
If you didn't believe it, you wouldn't act that way. Like by virtue of the fact that you're acting according to that map, it means that you believe it's the right one.
It's the right one.
Absolutely. That's just being coherent in your beliefs and your actions.
Exactly. And so I say that because I think one of the incorrect ways of approaching this, or unhelpful ways of approaching it, is to enter it with the assumption that in order for us to live together in that way and cooperate together, we have to accept the assumption that everybody's right or everybody's wrong or everybody's, a lot of faith perspectives and worldviews hold to the fact that they're the right one, and I don't think anybody has to necessarily give that up in order to live in harmony with each other, live in peace, cooperate, love one another, that you can have your map, you can believe that it really is the right one, and disagree with somebody about that, but still be on the journey together and still love one another, still serve one another, and still produce good in the community. So, yeah.
Yeah, the producing good in the community together sort of speaks for itself, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Well, Zac, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
So
yeah, this is one of our longer episodes.
Maybe we should just.
But it's hard to
keep talking and make it a two-parter.
No, it's great. Like I said, I appreciate that there is, I think, a role for long-form conversations in podcasts to get beyond our short attention spans and some of the media that I've fallen into it too. The Instagram Reels and the TikToks and the YouTube Shorts. Right. It's like you can lose 2 hours and consume 200 things.
Right.
Forget all of it.
Yeah.
Or take the time to really sit with somebody and try and unpack some things together. So I sincerely thank you guys for being open and willing to talk about this. And again, like I said at the beginning, I appreciate the fact that your organization has its cards on the table. This is a Christian organization that wants to show up and bring its full self to its projects in the city and invites Christians to do the same. And to the extent that you hit a sour note or a Christian hits a sour note, you want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And what's the number you gave? 84% of the community is Christian, something like that. Yeah. So in a lot of contexts, you will be speaking for the majority and acting for the majority in those contexts.
Right.
And there's a responsibility in that it seems like you are prepared to deal with whichever way it goes.
Well, thank you for that. And
thanks
again for your time and perspective. And I'm sure we'll have many more long conversations on or off the air. So
Look forward to it.